Hey. Hey, it's budding. Hey, look at that. It's gonna make it, huh?
Hey. Make it because have strong root. Just like you, Daniel-san. Inside you have strong root. No need nothing except what inside you to grow.
Hi, welcome to Around the World in 80s Movies. My name is Vince Leo. I am the author of the film review website Quipster.net. I invite you to check out all of my written work. Quipster.net is where to go, QWIPSTER.net. I've been doing film reviews since 1996 online. Check out all of that work there. And speaking of the 1990s, while you're on my website, I do encourage you to check out the link that goes to my other podcast that's called To the 90s and Beyond. Very similar to this one, of course, with newer films, sometimes slightly newer and sometimes movies that came out just yesterday. So check that out. Quipster.net is where to go. You can also search for To the 90s and Beyond wherever you're listening to this podcast right now and probably find it. Today I'm going to be getting into the third part of this three-part series looking at the Karate Kid films of the 1980s. Obviously, this is a franchise that continued on with a spin-off and a remake and also kind of a conglomeration of things coming out this year, as well as a streaming show called Cobra Kai, but also, as of this recording, currently in theaters as I speak, is Karate Kid Legends, which brings back Ralph Macchio into the films. And I will cover that film, as well as some of the other films, when I get into this series again, sometime in the future, on To the 90s and Beyond. But this will be the final Karate Kid film I talk about on this show. Karate Kid Part 3 came out in 1989. It is a PG-rated film. It does have violence as well as language. The runtime is an hour and 52 minutes. It brings back, of course, Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita. Thomas Ian Griffith, Robin Lively, Sean Kanan, and Jonathan Avildsen are some of the newcomers here. Returning in smaller roles, a smaller role than anticipated, is Martin Kove. And in a very small role, basically a cameo, Randy Heller returns as Daniel's mother. The director is, once again, John G. Avildsen, and the screenplay credited to Robert Mark Kamen, yet again. Now, in the weeks before the 1986 release of The Karate Kid Part 2, producer Jerry Weintraub, he was negotiating with screenwriter Robert Mark Kamen to create another script for what would become The Karate Kid Part 3. Now, with Part 2 being Columbia Pictures' top film of the year, once it was all said and done, a third installment was fast-tracked, and they hoped filming would begin by September of 1987. And Pat Morita and Ralph Macchio, they were already contractually obligated to make another installment of the series. Now, Morita wasn't super hot on this. He had some concerns about unrealistic storylines starting to develop in the series, but as long as people were willing to see them, as long as the films were profitable, he was willing to participate. Director John Avildsen, he was initially reluctant to direct another sequel, but he couldn't say no. There were a lot of financial benefits to taking on a third film, but he also regretted for a long time not directing the Rocky sequels. He felt that took his career off track from where it could have been. Ralph Macchio was the one who was most reluctant to return. In fact, he absolutely was adamant about not returning, and he sought to break free from his sequel contract because he had concerns at that point of his career about being further typecast as just another teenage heartthrob. He was already in his late 20s. Kamen was willing to create a story if Macchio didn't want to return that would feature Mr. Miyagi taking on a new student, but Jerry Weintraub, he refused. He wanted Macchio back. And it was primarily because Weintraub was focusing on securing funding for his new mini studio called the Weintraub Entertainment Group, WEG. He needed the seed money. He needed to make sure that he was still hot in Hollywood before he took on such an undertaking. Now, Macchio's agent was still very active in trying to get him out of the role. He couldn't secure his client's release, but he did successfully renegotiate Macchio's contract because he cited the box office success of The Karate Kid Part 2. It made even more money than the first one, and that was evidence of Macchio's bankability, at least in this series. But despite the bigger payday he was going to take in, Macchio remained just as uninterested in doing a sequel. In fact, he insisted on removing any sequel options, any mention, in the new renegotiated contract. And further adding insult to injury, sometime just a short time later, he needed to be on hand for Karate Kid Part 3, and that forced him to decline a role he had originally taken to be in Sidney Lumet's drama Running on Empty. And the worst part of it was that the part that he was going to be in would earn the person who replaced him in that film, River Phoenix, an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. In November of 1986, Robert Mark came and he sought to craft something completely different, something that would take Daniel away from high school altogether. And this would be something that was inspired by a lot of the martial arts films that he grew up enjoying, these Hong Kong wire fu films that he took in when he was in New York's Chinatown as a young man in the 1970s. And this would take Daniel and Mr. Miyagi back to 17th century China, kind of a time travel movie in a way, although it is really more of a dream sequence because in Kanan's story idea, Daniel and Mr. Miyagi are boating on this foggy night when Daniel is accidentally struck on the head by something and then he falls into a coma. And in his comatose dreams, it continues on as if he was still conscious. They spot Shimpo Miyagi, Mr. Miyagi's ancestor, and Shimpo would be played by Pat Morita in a dual role. And Shimpo is drifting in this old fishing vessel after falling asleep drunk. This is a story that Mr. Miyagi relates to Daniel in the Shinto shrine in Karate Kid Part 2. So basically, this is a film version of that story that he told about the bringing of the martial arts to Okinawa from Miyagi's ancestor. So Daniel and Mr. Miyagi follow the boat, and it takes them to China, and they discover that they're in the 1600s. But it would feature, a mounting battle between clans, a young Chinese woman. She would become the main protagonist of what happens in the story during this flashback or dream sequence or whatever you want to call it. Shimpo, during the process, he would learn how to fight in the martial arts. He would ultimately marry this Chinese heroine. They would have 2 children, and Shimpo would return with them all to Okinawa. And he would begin teaching the martial arts style that he learned in China to the people there in Okinawa. And eventually, Daniel, at some point in the end, wakes up from his coma. Columbia Pictures execs, well, they were actually surprisingly excited about making this into a film, but it wasn't because of the story. It was because their parent company, Coca-Cola, had been trying to make inroads in China, working with the Chinese government to try to increase the expanse of their products there. And so they felt that making a film in China, the Coca-Cola company who owned Columbia Pictures at the time would be able to negotiate, get a foothold pretty much into the country of 1 billion people. However, Columbia president at the time, Guy McElwain, as well as Jerry Weintraub, they opposed Kamen's idea outright because they believed, first of all, a period piece like this was going to be way too expensive. And they also were preferring to keep the story in Reseda, not only for cost savings, but also because they felt that the series really needed to return, if they wanted to retain all of the fans, back to Daniel in a karate tournament, defending his title against this formidable Cobra Kai opponent. John Kreese, he would be seeking revenge, and he would be training a new student that would try to take Daniel down. Disheartened by the lack of creative freedom that he was going to be offered by Columbia Pictures, as well as Jerry Weintraub, Robert Mark Kamen decided ultimately to decline taking on the screenwriting duties for the third film. Now, eventually, McElwain was replaced by another man named David Putnam, and David Putnam became the Columbia Pictures president, and he started raising concerns altogether about making any kind of Karate Kid sequel because he believed that any sequel should match or exceed the original's appeal. And he was particularly discouraged by not only the fact that they were going to be regurgitating a lot of the things that they had already done before, but also the budget constraints here would be even tighter because of these renegotiated salaries that they had done for the original cast, and all of this was going to hamper the overall quality. So the production started getting more and more delayed. Another year, ongoing negotiations with cast and crew to try to keep them all on board, and this allowed Macchio to explore other offers, including a role in a film called Distant Thunder that featured John Lithgow as the star. And Pat Morita took on a TV show called O'Hara. It was very short-lived, only lasted half a season, basically. And then Avildsen started doing directing of his own. Molly Ringwald vehicle called For Keeps. In December of 1987, Avildsen started taking on multiple projects, including his never-produced pet project, which was this biopic about Guardian Angels founder Curtis Lewa. And then he switched to becoming like this gun for hire on Lean on Me, which was this movie starring Morgan Freeman as a real-life unconventional high school principal called Joe Clark. Meanwhile, Columbia Pictures struggled to replace Kanan in the screenwriter position. And the reason why they struggled was because Kanan seemed to have, first of all, among all of the writers, a uniquely deep understanding of martial arts and the philosophy therein, but also he created all of these original characters. And the new screenwriters were having a difficult time trying to replicate the dialogue, the personalities. Altogether, they seemed like mimicry more than anything. They were not expanding, they were not growing. One particular attempt was by Alan Ormsby, who came up with a screenplay that would involve Daniel and Mr. Miyagi helping kids in the barrios of Los Angeles, where they would teach karate to these kids to help them avoid street gang involvement. Now, the plot would have featured a reformed Johnny Lawrence. He would become one of the teachers, a good guy. A reluctant John Kreese. He is still reeling from his experience. His hands are scarred, and he doesn't want to get involved after being humiliated by Mr. Miyagi at the beginning of Karate Kid Part 2. And then Dutch, one of the original Cobra Kai students under Kreese, he wants Kreese to get back involved. He wants to restore Cobra Kai to prominence. He would go rogue, and he would join forces with a neighborhood gang to disrupt the karate program from doing their business of helping the kids learn self-defense. They wanted to be able to run the show there in the neighborhood, and they felt that this was going to not be good for business. So Dutch becomes basically the bad guy, and that was played by Chad McQueen from the original film. Now, in 1987, newly hired Columbia Pictures president Dawn Steele, she took over for Putnam, and she saw Karate Kid 3 completely unlike Putnam. She saw it as an unmined gem just waiting there, an uncashed check, basically. She invited screenwriter Kanan to return. She felt that he was absolutely needed if they wanted to bring Karate Kid back to life, emphasizing that while the film was going to move forward with or without his participation, he probably wouldn't want to see this film continue with somebody else writing Mr. Miyagi, for instance. His involvement was crucial for accurately portraying that character. She also agreed to meet Kanan's salary. She asked him what would it take for him to come back. He named a number, and she said, okay. And so he came back. He was going to do for that fee whatever they wanted, whatever Weintraub and the Columbia executives wanted for their story. He would just make it happen. But still, continued delays did take place. A looming writer strike raised a lot of uncertainty about things, as well as Macchio's availability for filming. However, by July of 1988, all key cast and crew did confirm their readiness to proceed after the strike, despite having no approved completed script to read at the time. Now, unfortunately, the day after Martin Kove confirmed his return for Karate Kid Part 3, a TV series he was going to be working on was greenlit, called Hard Times on Planet Earth. And the shooting schedule for the TV show was going to conflict with when they wanted to make Karate Kid Part 3. His agent tried very hard to secure his release from the TV show, but he could not. The makers of the show weren't willing to reschedule because they needed to get this done, and since Martin Kove was the star of this TV series, they had no option but to make Martin Kove come in. And the show, because it required 15-hour workdays, meant that basically Martin Kove would seemingly be unavailable at all for Karate Kid Part 3. However, Assistant Director Cliff Coleman, he suggested a unique idea, which was for them to film only on weekends for Kove's scenes. That seemed to be an option there that Kove is willing to do. But John Avildsen felt that Kreese's role was too significant. It was probably the biggest role in the third film as it was going to exist. And he was not going to be able to fit all of what he needed to do in that very limited time frame, including some martial arts and choreography as well. So consequently, the script was rewritten to introduce a new antagonist that would serve as a surrogate for Kreese's revenge. And while Kove did manage to come over and film a few scenes, there were key moments that were still cut due to time constraints. There was a fight between Kreese and Miyagi that would have required weeks of choreography rehearsals that was unfortunately cut from the final film. As far as what the final film is like, well, in the final plot, John Kreese is left destitute after losing his students at the Cobra Kai dojo. And so Kreese confides in Terry Silver. Silver's this wealthy former comrade of his from Vietnam, and he's also a co-founder of the Cobra Kai dojo. Silver offers to send Kreese to Tahiti to, kind of lick his wounds while he revitalizes the dojo on his behalf. And Silver decides he's going to do that by humiliating Daniel at the All Valley Karate Tournament to try to reestablish Cobra Kai's dominance and to help Kreese regain his confidence enough to take over once again. Mr. Miyagi advises Daniel against defending his title, stating that fighting without honor is meaningless. And so Daniel does play ball with that for a while. He uses his money to support Mr. Miyagi after Miyagi loses his job because the apartment complex he had a job in was demolished. And this would enable Mr. Miyagi to open a bonsai shop. Meanwhile, Terry Silver, he hires Mike Barnes, the so-called bad boy of karate, to pressure Daniel to join the tournament as the defending champion and be defeated, hopefully, by this bad boy, Mike Barnes. When theater actor Thomas Ian Griffith read the script treatment, he wasn't sure which role he was actually going for. At 27 years old, Griffith felt, well, he was too old to play a high schooler like Mike Barnes, although, in truth, Thomas Ian Griffith was 4 months younger than Ralph Macchio at the time. But it also seemed unlikely that he was going to portray this sensei and Vietnam veteran who served alongside Kreese, a man in his 40s, especially given that Thomas Ian Griffith at 27 would have been just 13 at the time the Vietnam conflict ended in 1975. So there was no way he was ever going to be believable in that role, he thought. But during rehearsals, Avildsen encouraged Griffith to portray Terry Silver as more villainous a character than John Kreese. Although Griffith was concerned about being a little too over the top in his portrayal, Avildsen believed that an exaggerated performance was going to leave a significant impact. And he famously expressed that his desire was for every kid in America to want to kick Griffith's shins after they see him play such a despicable character in this film. Now, when fight trainer and choreographer Pat Johnson learned that Griffith was skilled in Taekwondo and Kempo, he encouraged him to go discuss doing maybe some fight scenes for Silver with director John Avildsen. And impressed by Griffith's abilities, Avildsen decided that they should revise the script to highlight Silver as a fellow karate master. And Griffith suggested ways that he would have Silver intimidate Daniel, and that eventually led to a subplot, a teacher-student subplot, in which Silver takes on Daniel as a student and then proceeds to manipulate him or gaslight him, causing him to turn away from everything Mr. Miyagi had originally taught him. In November of 1988, casting calls were announced trying to look for a male teenager to portray Mike Barnes. It was kind of a publicity stunt, I guess, for the movie as well. Mike Barnes would be Daniel's tournament opponent. The casting directors were here looking specifically for a Caucasian male between 5'8" and 5'11", who had experience in karate or wrestling or boxing or all three, and appeared to be no older than 18. Now, over 2,000 hopefuls auditioned both in New York as well as Los Angeles, and the role in the end ultimately went to 22-year-old Sean Kanan, who was a pre-law student at UCLA at the time. Now, Kanan, he was originally born as Sean Perelman. He was trained in kickboxing. He had already, by this time, earned a green belt in Shotokan karate, which is something he had studied for nearly a decade. He also, while he was in school, studied political science and drama while he was at Boston University. He also performed some stand-up comedy. He secured minor roles while in Boston on the Boston-based TV drama called Spencer for Hire. And that was before he eventually transferred to UCLA for more acting opportunities. Now, his newly hired agent suggested that he change his name from Sean Perelman to Sean Kanan because he felt that that sounded more strong of a name, and it kind of had biblical connotations as well. And so Kanan soon landed a role in this low-budget horror film called Hide and Go Shriek. Now, Kanan happened to be a huge fan of the Karate Kid films, He had seen both Karate Kid 1 and 2 at least 10 times each. He had dreamed of, at some point, being part of the franchise. His mother, knowing his love for the films, said that she saw an advertisement for a casting call for Karate Kid Part 3 in Los Angeles. And Kanan happened to be in Los Angeles studying Gembukai Karate, something he had studied in Newcastle, Pennsylvania at one of the schools led by Chief Instructor Fumio Demura, and Demura happened to be Pat Morita's stunt double in the original movie. Now, when Kanan moved to Los Angeles, he was able to train directly with Demura at his headquarters in Santa Ana. And after discussing the casting call, Demura encouraged him to attend it. Now, Kanan decided he was going to attend it, but he might try to get a leg up on the competition by visiting casting director Carol Jones at her office to try to secure an audition, but she refused to see him, advising him to try out at the official casting call with everybody else. Now, among all of the 1,000 plus applicants that were there in Los Angeles, Kanan was one of the ones picked out by John Avildsen outside the Burbank studios because he was very intrigued in seeing his look and his demeanor. And so he stopped and he asked Kanan to improvise a scene with him, instructing him to pretend that he was Ralph Macchio and that Kanan wanted to initiate a fight. So Kanan delivered a very intense ad-libbed performance, grabbing Avildsen by the arm and threatening to come into his kitchen with a butcher knife if he didn't get an audition, to try to intimidate him. And Avildsen was intimidated. He was very impressed by Kanan, and as well as some of the other candidates, he took them into the soundstage for further auditions. Now, after an intense audition, Kanan and other finalists returned later for a screen test where they faced Ralph Macchio in a karate match of a sort. The casting team wanted to see what they called a white 17-year-old version of Mike Tyson. So Kanan decided to try to bring a little bit more nuance than just being a thug into the character, but Avildsen insisted that the character was driven here solely by money. Showing sympathy for him or toward Daniel would hurt him in the role. So before his audition, Kanan reassured Macchio he was going to try everything he could to get the part, but he would mean him no harm. He wasn't actually going to hurt him. But despite this, Macchio still felt very intimidated when Kanan started coming after him, and he asked Avildsen to just call him off to intervene when he was cornered by Kanan. Now, after leaving the audition on a high note, Kanan was initially optimistic about landing the role, but he soon felt disheartened to learn that the part actually had gone to someone else. He didn't know who it was, but it turned out to be this blonde surfer type named Daryl, who actually had very little martial arts experience and no acting experience before, but John Avildsen took a chance on because he felt that he had the right look. However, once rehearsals began, it became clear that Daryl was failing to muster the ferocity necessary for the role, and he increasingly grew overwhelmed by the pressure there, and so they felt it was better to just part ways with Daryl. So a week after his initial audition, Kanan received a phone call from executive producer Sheldon Schrager, who told him that the actor that they initially cast as Mike Barnes had been fired, and they wanted to meet with him. Upon arrival, Kanan first met with Robert Mark Kamen. Kamen asked him to demonstrate some martial arts moves, and after approving of his skills, Kamen joined director John Avildsen as well as Schrager in a private office. And then following a short discussion, Schrager informed Kanan that he had the role, he was going to make X amount of money, and instructed him to head directly to wardrobe to get fitted for his attire. At that time, Kanan weighed 185 pounds, so one of the things that they advised him to do is to try to lose 25 pounds by the time they started filming. So he had to improve his fitness as well as his diet over the next few weeks. To achieve this, he cut his daily calorie intake to 1,500 calories and incorporated aerobic exercise and weight training into his routine. And additionally, the director, Avildsen, felt that he needed to look even more like a bad boy because he still looked kind of like a boy next door, so he advised Kanan he wanted to see him get a flat top haircut to look like that stereotypical bad boy. Now, before filming began, Pat Morita, he requested a Buddhist blessing ceremony for the cast and the crew and the set. It was similar to one that actually was held before Karate Kid Part 2. Now, despite this blessing, though, the team encountered nothing but setbacks, pretty much. One significant issue that happened during the shoot was Macchio contracted severe poison oak while he was filming at the Devil's Cauldron scene. That place is actually known as the Devil's Basin in Elk, California, in Northern California. And that resulted in a 2-week production delay. And additionally, there were further delays when Pat Morita himself developed pink eye. Avildsen remarked, after seeing all of the calamities that were occurring, that he had never experienced so many obstacles during a production. And he recalled, after having the Buddhist monks bless Karate Kid Part 2, that it did nothing but rain for 2 straight weeks. And believe it or not, it did get worse. On the 9th day of filming, Sean Kanan, the bad boy Mike Borans, he injured himself during a stunt that required him to jump several feet into the air and then land on his side. He repeated that over 14 takes. And after he was done, he started feeling progressive pain in his left thigh, and he started taking aspirin to try to relieve that pain. Luckily, it was right before Christmas break, so he would have time to recuperate, presumably, before he started shooting again. Kanan decided to visit Las Vegas with his girlfriend at the time. Unfortunately, at that time, he started feeling weak and he fainted in the lobby at the Dunes Hotel, and he was immediately rushed to Humana Hospital Sunrise. While there, still unconscious, the emergency room doctors were urgently trying to raise Kanan's dangerously low blood pressure, and they were having very little success, and they determined that surgery was absolutely essential if they were going to save his life. Now, Kanan, when he finally came to, he agreed to the surgical procedure only if the medical staff avoided cutting into his abdominal muscles, because he needed those muscles to perform martial arts on the set in 2 days. And concerned for his life, the team there accepted his conditions, despite having complete uncertainty about whether they could actually save him due to the unknown cause of his blood loss, his blood pressure drop. When they finally did perform the surgery, doctors did discover 2 liters of blood were pulled in Kanan's abdomen from this perforated greater omentum. The blood-thinning aspirin that Kanan had been taking for pain management was worsening his condition. He was bleeding even more, and it put him at risk for fatality if treatment had been delayed any further. Now, while they were able to quickly cauterize the rupture, the doctors did warn Kanan that he might not be able to resume physical activity as soon as he'd hoped. Definitely not within 2 days. When word of this got back to the producers, they showed very little sympathy for Kanan's position, and they quickly began auditioning potential replacements mid-shoot. One of the candidates that they were strongly considering was Brandon Lee, the son of Bruce Lee, whom Pat Morita had met while they were filming an episode of O'Hara. Eager to retain his role, though, Sean Kanan begged John Avildsen for more time. Now, Avildsen was caught in a weird situation because he recognized that Kanan was the more talented actor that they had seen, and choreographer Pat Johnson was very disappointed in seeing Brandon Lee's martial arts skills. So there was some impetus to try to delay for a little while, and so Avildsen decided, to rationalize the delay, that filming Kanan's scenes would probably extend the shooting schedule by 2 weeks to get somebody else up to speed. And so basically it bought Kanan a couple of weeks to get back on the set. They proposed using Kanan's stunt double for the action sequences once he returned, and that would allow them to insert Kanan into close-up shots during the shoot while this other person performed the physical parts. Now, filming with the stunt double unfortunately did not go well because the stunt double lacked convincing martial arts skills to do the role. So Kanan was informed at that point he really had a week to return to the set and perform as he should before he was going to be replaced with Brandon Lee. Brandon Lee may have been disappointing in terms of his martial arts skills, but he still presumably would have been better than an injured and recuperating Sean Kanan. So Kanan decided he was angry about this, and he began exercising with great pain every day to rebuild his strength more and more. And after 5 days, he checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice, with staples still holding his abdomen together, with blood still coming out of that wound when he exerted too much on his body. Avildsen filmed Kanan's scenes in close-up and then postponed the physical components until Kanan had healed enough to perform them in the shoot sometime later. Now, Pat Johnson was particularly glad to see Kanan return, not only because he was skeptical about Brandon Lee, but he also noted that Kanan had this immaturity about himself and also a certain inexperience that brought a lot of edginess and realism to the fight scenes that he had with Macchio. Macchio seemed genuinely tense whenever having to act with Kanan in a scene because he was unsure if Kanan might inadvertently hurt him, and that added to the intensity of the performances. However, Kanan did deeply respect Ralph Macchio. He found Macchio reserved, without any of that Hollywood ego, very refreshing in that regard, seemingly indifferent to his fame. In fact, Macchio was known to return to his Long Island home to be with his family whenever he was not needed to film. Now, others observed Macchio a little bit differently. They thought Macchio was actually visibly unhappy on the set, and he would sometimes arrive late. And he was very frequent, very quick to express his frustration, especially with John Avildsen, that his efforts to try to mature Daniel were being ignored. He wanted Daniel to expand and not be such a whiny teenager. And he especially did not like that Daniel seemed to forget everything that Mr. Miyagi taught him in the first two Karate Kid films. So Avildsen reminded Macchio that he needed to embody the mindset of an adolescent and to try to avoid the quick resolutions that he felt as an adult. Now, although Macchio found it easy to portray a teenager because, hey, he had been a teenager before, so he just had to call back to how he felt at the time, he noted that a lot of memories of being a teenager tended to fade over the 10 years since being one. Now, as it was certain that Macchio was going to be done with the series after Part 3, there was no question Macchio said he was not coming back. Avildsen actually seriously considered a tragic ending for Daniel, where Daniel would die defending Miyagi's honor, and that would leave Miyagi heartbroken toward the end of the film with the line, "I taught him too well." And this would free Miyagi eventually to teach a new student in the fourth film. Obviously, they didn't go with the tragic ending for Daniel, and probably for Macchio's benefit, because he would end up reprising that role and loving coming back to it, not only in the Cobra Kai series, but also in Karate Kid Legends. Now, Liana Creel, she was initially cast as Jessica Andrews, who happens to be what should have been Daniel's love interest, but she withdrew because she had a scheduling conflict with another project she was destined to work on, Parent Trap 3. So, Robin Lively took over the role, and she beat out a lot of other contenders like Heather Graham. Robin Lively happened to be 16 at the time, and since Ralph Macchio was 27, a young-looking 27, he felt a little uneasy about doing any kind of kissing or romantic scenes with a teenager. So Jessica's character was changed instead to having a boyfriend, and so she could only be a platonic friend to Daniel. So Macchio actually preferred this because his wife Phyllis would sometimes grow very jealous of seeing him in his on-screen romances. Now, John Avildsen's 19-year-old son, Jonathan, auditioned for the role of Mike Barnes. He was one of the many thousands that were not cast, but they were still impressed with his acting skills, so Avildsen and screenwriter Robert Mark Kamen created a new character for Jonathan Avildsen to portray Snake, who is this goon that Terry Silver hires to assist Barnes in trying to coerce Daniel into defending his championship in the All Valley Karate Tournament once again. Audition footage from Part 3 that showcases Jonathan Avildsen reveals that actually at this time, it seemed that Mike Barnes' initial motivation for pushing Daniel to compete was not strictly based on money. In fact, it was to try to gain respect among his family and his peers, because by defeating the reigning champion, he would be doing honor to his family's karate legacy. His brothers, his older brothers, had also been champion of that same tournament, and he felt that he needed to prove himself to his family by also becoming the champion. And the best way to show that he was worthy of it was to defeat the current champion. However, in further revisions, they stripped all of that away, and that was primarily to avoid overshadowing Terry Silver's villainy. So in the final version, Barnes pressures Daniel to fight due to a financial deal, strictly a financial deal, that he has with Terry Silver. Now, Kanan didn't really like that motivation. He wanted to find some humanity in his character, even though he was not really given much on the written page. So for motivation, Kanan created his own backstory to why Mike Barnes does what he does. He concocted in his mind that Barnes was pressuring Daniel to compete because he needed that money for his grandmother's life-saving surgery. Now, Christopher Paul Ford, who's like one of the henchmen to Mike Barnes in this movie, he's actually called William Christopher Ford today because in 2006 he was honoring his recently deceased father, William. He was one of the finalists for the role of Mike Barnes originally, but he was later cast as a henchman because they wanted to enhance some of the martial arts elements, and he was very skilled at martial arts. They allowed him to choose a name for his character, and he chose the name Dennis because he felt, his character was supposed to be a menace in this film. So Dennis the Menace was a playful reference, and he became Dennis. So he was cast, and he actually became very fast friends with Sean Kanan, who eventually took the role, and remains friends with him to this day. Now, as far as Daniel's mother being in this film for one scene, Lucille, Macchio requested that they bring back Randy Heller because he felt that Lucille needed to be in this film. She was completely absent in part 2. They needed to highlight that close relationship that they originally had in the first film that seemed to be absent, and they needed to bring it back. And Avildsen agreed, so came and added a scene where Lucille is on a phone call with Daniel, talking about why she can't be there. She's with a relative in New Jersey who has emphysema. Now, interestingly enough, despite Karate Kid Part 2 being the most financially successful film in the series, it actually has almost no effect on the plot or the characters in Part 3. I mean, you see them coming back from Okinawa at the very beginning of the film, but very little reference after that. That wasn't originally the case. They were going to tie in much more to the events happening in Okinawa at the end of Part 2. Nobu McCarthy was actually asked to play Yuki for a small role in Part 3, and then Bob Garrison, who was from the first Karate Kid film, Tommy, he was asked to appear as well in Part 3, but subsequent revisions eventually cut out their characters altogether, and so they were not included. As for the music, because music, especially in a film like this in the 1980s, was a very big component in terms of promotion, Hawaiian teen pop idol Glenn Medeiros, he was invited to participate in a concert scene in the film, and he also contributed on 3 songs to the soundtrack. His cameo performance is set in a nightclub in Los Angeles, and that includes a dance routine that's choreographed by none other than Paula Abdul, who happened to be a breakout performer of her own, a pop performer in 1989. Although Medeiros originally planned to promote the film with having the title track, ultimately they decided to go a completely different direction and have another song that was written by Tom Kelly and Billy Steinberg, a very hot songwriting team at the time. And they wrote a song called Listen to Your Heart that was performed by the Little River Band. Unfortunately, it really didn't go much of anywhere compared to the songs that were featured in the first 2 Karate Kid films, so maybe that wasn't the best choice. Now, Bill Conti also returns here to compose the score for the 3rd Karate Kid film, and this marked his 11th collaboration with director John Avildsen as his composer. Now, Macchio, who initially claimed that the Karate Kid Part 3 would be his final portrayal of Daniel LaRusso, he decided he was going to have a memento, and he decided he was going to buy the yellow 1947 Ford Super Deluxe that was gifted to Daniel by Mr. Miyagi in the first Karate Kid film. He wanted to keep that as a memory of his time there. But Macchio's offer was declined. They would have none of it because the production team actually decided to gift him the car instead in appreciation for coming back for Part 3. Macchio kept that car mostly in storage over the years, but he did bring it back out. He dusted it off and back out for the Cobra Kai series. Daniel is still driving that car. Columbia Pictures, they originally planned to release Karate Kid Part 3 on June 23rd, 1989, but they decided to postpone it one more week to avoid direct competition with Batman. Macchio and Morita, they were out and about helping promote the movie, touring 20 major cities at the time. The production budget was $15 million. They included an additional $6 million earmarked for advertising. And to enhance its success, the underperforming marketing department was completely restructured by Don Steele at the time to try to get maximum impact. Now, Avildsen happened to be still editing the film less than a month before its release. So they were doing all this promoting for a film that nobody had yet seen, and they weren't even sure what it was like. So Avildsen was making changes right up till the last possible moment. And due to a lot of delays and weather issues, Avildsen was still filming establishing shots around Los Angeles 3 months after principal photography had ended. And Pat Morita, in his interviews, called it kind of a mystery movie because only Avildsen had seen it before its release. And unfortunately, it all led up to naught because Karate Kid Part 3, when it was released, was a misfire, not only critically, but also commercially at the box office. Now, Karate Kid 3 happens to be darker. It's less humorous than the earlier films, and that makes it of less appeal to that broader audience that they were trying to keep on board. The film particularly targets young teenage boys, so if you were a young teenager at the time you saw this, it probably hit you, but very little outside of that demographic really regards Part 3 as very worthwhile. Ralph Macchio himself, he criticized the movie because he felt it had an underdeveloped script and a complete lack of character progression from previous installments. He never really liked talking about part 3 beyond the initial promotions that he was paid to do. Frequent rewrites were leading to a frustrating filming experience, not only for Macchio, but the rest of the actors also expressed some frustration that the film seemed to be going all kinds of different directions and rarely in a direction that was better. It's like when Miyagi was teaching Daniel that fighting for honor is essential and fighting for trophies is meaningless. Unfortunately, Karate Kid Part 3 overlooks this lesson altogether because it seems to exist solely to exploit the franchise. It's doing it just for the money, not for the honor. The sluggish plot here mirroring too closely to Rocky 3. You have a challenger who decides he's going to humiliate the retiring champion to get back in and fight so that he can become the champion by defeating somebody who was actually the champion at the time. And the film would ultimately get nominated for the Golden Raspberry Awards, those Razzies for the worst movies of the year. It got nominated for Worst Picture, Worst Director, and Worst Screenplay. I would say the best parts of Karate Kid are the interactions between Miyagi and Daniel. When you see them together, there's still some of that magic that is left. Macchio and Morita are still very enjoyable despite having a weak story around them. At 27, Macchio does show some aging here. He appears slightly puffy, maybe less toned than he should be. Thomas Ian Griffith, though, is still the show stealer for a lot of people. He delivers a very strong performance in his debut film, even though he was, miscast as a Vietnam War veteran. But his genuine mentorship of Daniel very much contrasts well with Silver's manipulative actions. In fact, if it wasn't for some of the more cartoonish moments, it would actually be believable that he would be trying to help Daniel. The villains here, though, are more exaggerated than in Part 2, which were very exaggerated as well at the time. I compared the villains in Part 2 to being cartoonish. This was even more off the wall in terms of cartoonish villainy. And cartoonish seems to be appropriate because, the Karate Kid animated series would appear on television that same year. So maybe they were really going for that cartoon kid demographic in a big way by the end of this. Columbia Pictures finally allowed Daniel to retire after Part 3's disappointing box office. It took in only $39.8 million. And the film opened at number 3 with only $10 million to take and then quickly dropped out of the rankings within 3 weeks due to poor reviews and intense competition in the summer of 1989. So 2.5 stars out of 4. 2.5 stars on my scale means that it's had the tools, had the talent to be something more. I mean, you had all of the talent back still from Karate Kid Parts 1 and 2. And even if John Kreese had a diminished performance, you could argue that Thomas Ian Griffith, with his very charismatic performance, did a good job. Sean Kanan, I think, does pretty well in what's a one-dimensional role, but he is still very memorable. I think the supporting cast does what it can. But the lack of script, the lack of direction, and plot holes, and the regurgitation of the formula just makes it feel like sloppy and underdeveloped goods that just tries to ride the coattails of the films that came before, while also ignoring a lot of what came before in a way that rubbed a lot of the series fans the wrong way, and they didn't really come back for repeat showings like they did for the first 2. So that's why I can only give The Karate Kid Part 3 2.5 stars, a generous 2.5. I think a lot of other critics rate it below that, probably 1.5 or 2-star movie for most critics. But I'm more inclined to like a film like this because I like martial arts and I like these actors, and there's a lot of nostalgia value still left over for me that keeps me very interested in what's going on, even though I concede it's definitely a lesser effort than the other 2 films. Now, another thing that has people reevaluating Karate Kid Part 3 is the fact that many actors from the Karate Kid Part 3 did make a return sometime later. They redeemed themselves on the streaming show Cobra Kai. They came back starting basically with season 4 primarily and into 5 and 6. Thomas Ian Griffith and Robin Lively even makes an appearance. Sean Kanan reprises this role, although more of a good guy in the subsequent series. Obviously, Ralph Macchio does return as well and embraces the role this time out in Cobra Kai. So a lot of people have retroactively been more fond of Karate Kid Part 3 than they would have if Cobra Kai did not exist. And so maybe my 2.5-star rating is a reevaluation a lot of other people might make at this point. If you have your own thoughts on The Karate Kid Part 3 that you want to impart, maybe you think that it really does deserve a lot less than 2.5 stars, or maybe a little bit more, who knows. But You can write to me. You can find my contact information at my website. That's at quipster.net, QWIPSTER.net. The same spelling, quipster@gmail.com is where you can write to me. If you want to help out the show in any particular way, wherever you're listening to this, if you have the ability to rate the show or to say a few words about what you like about the show, it definitely helps get the word out there. So please do so if you haven't done so already. Well, as far as what I'm going to be talking about next week, well, obviously it's not going to be another Karate Kid film, but I will talk about a film that kind of ties in because it features a main actor that happened to be in a couple of Karate Kid films. Not one of the original Karate Kid trilogy here, but happened to be in the 2010 Karate Kid remake as kind of in the Miyagi role, so to speak, and also in Karate Kid Legends along with Ralph Macchio. He is Jackie Chan, and I'm going to be talking about his very first American film, Battle Creek Brawl, or called The Big Brawl, if you were like me who saw it on cable in the 1980s. It was called The Big Brawl there, but it's originally called Battle Creek Brawl, and it has been retitled again Battle Creek Brawl. It's gone on to the original title if you find it on video for the most part. You can still see The Big Brawl on some video releases, but Battle Creek Brawl will be the film I talk about next. It features not only Jackie Chan, who is tied in with the Karate Kid movies, but also it features, just like the Karate Kid, a reluctant participant in a championship fight match. So very much tied in somewhat with Karate Kid in that way. So check that out if you haven't checked that out already, from 1980, Battle Creek Brawl. That'll be coming up, and until next time, thank you so much, everybody, for listening and joining me as I continue this journey around the world in 80s movies.